Good evening. I'm Susan Weaver, and I'm the director of the Museum of Ceramics. Let me get this going first. There we go. In East Liverpool, Ohio, a town that was once the pottery capital of the nation. In the early 1900s, this city was producing half the dinnerware for the United States market. In our history of potteries, we've had over 200. They would spew smoke from those bottle kilns you see there as they mass-produced dinnerware, toiletware, and even lotusware, the finest bone china ever made in the United States. I have lived in this city, in this area, my entire life, and despite what I'm going to tell you in just a moment, it's a beautiful part of the country. The southern part of the city is the Ohio River, and the northern part of the city is rolling hills, forested rolling hills. But the town itself has suffered a great decline. That decline started probably about 1930s when Japan took over 50% of the American market. But the biggest blow was in the 1970s when the steel industry collapsed. And a lot of our area people lost their jobs. Our town shrank from 26,000 residents to 11,000 residents. As they left behind vacant houses and boarded up storefronts. It seemed that when they left, they took with them their pride and our positive attitude as well. The unemployment brought poverty, and poverty brought a drug problem. Our local pottery festival became known by the derogatory term, the Poverty Festival. And in an attempt to clean up the city's drug problem, the city administration posted a photograph that went viral. And I'm going to show you that photograph, but I'm going to warn you that it's very graphic and can be disturbing. So if you choose not to look, you might want to look away now. This photograph went viral all over the world. Okay, we are now on to the next slide. I'm happy to tell you that the people in that photograph did survive that, but the town's reputation didn't. That photograph told the world that East Liverpool is a place that you don't want to be. And that was the culture when I became the director of the Museum of Ceramics. But the museum is a gem in this city. It's one of 50 sites owned and operated by the Ohio History Connection and operated locally by the Museum of Ceramics Foundation. It has 2 floors that are beautifully designed, professionally researched, and it provides the pottery history for anyone who visits and shows the artifacts of that industry. I had just retired from Kent State when they asked me to be director. And I said yes, for 2 reasons. One is that I really like this kind of work. I like museum work. And 2, I saw that the museum would be a real challenge, and I wanted to take on that challenge. Now, I just told you the museum is a gem. It wasn't the museum itself, but it was the museum's role in the community. I thought it was not living up to its potential in our community. In our community, the people in East Liverpool, they don't come into the museum. If they've been there once, they've seen everything, they don't see any reason to come back. So it was time to give them a reason to come back, and the timing was good. Now, I also want to say, though, that we have a great, small but loyal and wonderful following of volunteers and benefactors who do support the museum and give us their money annually and do events and work with us weekly as volunteers. So research tells us that 55% of all communication is nonverbal. It's a hand gesture or body language or a facial expression. And I thought it was kind of interesting that our first signals to the community that we were going to change were nonverbal as well. The first thing we did is we took down the chains. And that's not a metaphor. We literally took down chains. In this photograph you see here, the steps go up to our entry door. But every night, a staff member would go down to the bottom of those steps and link a chain across those rails to keep passersby from sitting on the steps and to keep the skateboarders off. But we took the chains down. And some people in town did notice that, not everybody, but it was a very significant and symbolic act for those of us at the museum. So much so that I kept a couple of those chains, and they're in my desk drawer. And every time I see them, it's a reminder to me that This is not my museum, as I tend to call it. This is a museum of the community and of the world, and that we always need to be welcoming and inclusionary. The second signal we sent is when we reopened in April. The museum closes, it's Ohio, you know, in January, February, and March for the winter months, and we open around the beginning of April. So in that year, we opened with a big celebration, and it was a Mardi Gras. Now, because Mardi Gras had already passed that year by that date, we called our Mardi Gras the Hardy Tardy Mardi Gras Party. And we decorated the outside of the museum, and inside, when you went in, our main gallery was Bourbon Street with free-flowing wine and beer. We turned our theater into Preservation Hall, and we even served beignets in the Café du Mock, Mock standing for Museum of Ceramics. We were sending the signal to our community that we were going to change and things were going to be different. And we went about adding more and more events. And I'm just going to tell you about a few of those events. One is, we called it Music at the Mock. And it's where local musicians could play original music in a coffee house-like setting. We started mock talks, sort of our version of TED Talks on Friday mornings. We had big events like a speakeasy, when a group in town produced and released a film about the capture of Pretty Boy Floyd, a gangster who was captured in East Liverpool. We debuted the film. People came dressed as flappers and gangsters and were able to take their photo by an antique car holding Tommy gun. And probably my favorite is Clay Academy. And this is a week-long day camp for kids ages 10 to 14, where they get immersed in pottery history and pottery techniques, where they do ceramic mosaics and throw on a potter's wheel, where they learn doorknob toss. Ceramic doorknobs were made in East Liverpool, and doorknob toss has been played there for over 150 years, kind of the predecessor to cornhole. So we love the Clay Academy so much that we're going to expand it this summer and have a bigger program with 4 more age groups. So I mentioned earlier my timing was good when I took this job, because as the museum is expanding our offerings and giving people in town someplace to go, social and educational programs, I noticed that other groups are doing things around town too. The Beacon Association is doing the Christmas parade. The retailers in town are doing late night shopping sprees. And a group called East Liverpool Community Partnership for Revitalization was doing a lot of good things. Now, that's a terrible name for a committee, but it has a great set of initials. It's ELCPR. And that's exactly what they were doing. They were breathing life into the community with big events like the Jazz and Barbecue Festival. So what we see are all these random acts of progress happening in East Liverpool. But random acts of progress don't make lasting change. But then the next step, maybe just natural progression, these groups started working together. ELCPR called me and some others, and we put together a tourism brochure of 6 things to do when you're in East Liverpool. The retailers started contacting us, and we started staying open late the same nights they had their shopping nights. And then we started reaching out, not only to musicians, we started reaching out to the authors in town, local authors, where they could do book signings and promote their books by doing talks in the museum. One of the best partnerships we have is local artists. They now teach weekly classes in the museum, and they have an art show scheduled for later this month. More and more of these groups started working together, and good things started happening. And one of the things we started seeing happening was the culture shift in the town to a much more positive attitude. Another turning point was when a new restaurant opened in town in a wonderful old bank building, one of those beautiful high-ceilinged buildings with lots of granite and marble. It's the kind of restaurant that people come from miles around to go to. And they opened just feet from our doorstep. And when I heard they were opening, before they even served their first meal, I gave them a call and said, "Welcome to the Hood. Let's work together." And we started First Fridays. You've probably heard of First Fridays. Lots of cities do them. It's just a nice big street fair with food vendors and music, and people can meet their neighbors and have a good time. But as we started making more and more of these partnerships, we found more and more partnerships out there. A businessman came to me and said, I'm starting a lighting business. Can we light up the museum for a First Friday? And so this happened. So there we are in lime green and fuchsia at one of the First Fridays. The colors on the buildings are pulsating to the beat of the rock band. And yes, we looked more like a strip joint than a museum, but we got a lot of attention that night. And so did the new business. So much so that about 2 weeks later, another businessman in town came to me and said, I'd like to donate money to put permanent lights on the building. And he did make it very clear that he had something a little more subtle in mind than what you see here. So after 5 years of being director of the Museum of Ceramics, I really felt that we were a community museum as these groups work together more and more. We're a museum now where everybody knows our name, where every time there's a big city event, we get asked to participate. Whenever we have a big event, we call our partners and they participate. Now, don't get me wrong, we haven't turned the whole town of East Liverpool around by providing these social and educational opportunities. There are still empty houses, there are still boarded up storefronts. People aren't flocking back to town yet. But what has returned to town is this. Hope has returned, and pride, and love of community. And with those things back in our town, I know we will succeed. And yes, I've been called a Pollyanna. I usually say thank you for the compliment. I'm very optimistic. My partnerships are still at work here, but there are other partnerships going as well. There are trying to improve the quality of life in our town. There are people working on the education system. We have people working on economic development. I learned just this week that 20 of those vacant houses in East Liverpool were torn down over the last couple months, and that 7 of those empty buildings, ones with the boarded up storefronts, have been purchased and are being renovated for new businesses. So there is great hope in our town. Now, I have, during most of my working career, carried this one quote with me in my head because I find it really inspirational, and it goes like this. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. That's by Margaret Mead. She was an anthropologist, so she knows a lot about people, right? And as I was putting this program together and thinking about the word unity and what it meant for East Liverpool, one of the days I was looking at this word, and it's jumped out at me, I know this is going to sound hokey, that the first 3 letters are U-N-I. U-N-I. And in this days of texting and abbreviating everything, it just jumped out at me that it means you and I. You and I can change the world. One museum at a time, one town at a time. Just ask Margaret Mead. She said so. Now, this is the part of the program where I apologize, because you might remember the name of my talk was A Museum, a Puppy, in a Town. I just thought if I included a puppy, it would make it sound more interesting. So, but not to shortchange you, here's the puppy, and she and I thank you for listening.